The company is being reborn, so we no longer need a high school dropout like you. We don't need bottom-rung people like you in the new company. From now on, our company intends to cut out the bad parts. So, you should disappear as well."
That was said to me by the executive vice president of the company. He is a big believer in educational elitism and seems to have been displeased for a while about having a high school dropout like me in his company. Using a department head who was loyal to him, he repeatedly subjected me to workplace harassment, trying to drive me out of a company. I agree, it's time for a refresh. The executive vice president looks surprised at my words. It appears he assumed I would just quietly leave the company. But there was another meaning to my words. The next day, the executive vice president would come to regret what he had done for the rest of his life. It was the summer when I was in 3rd grade. My family went on a trip during the summer break, but the freeway was very congested, and our car was involved in a pile-up accident. Fortunately, I only had minor injuries. But when I woke up, my parents were already gone from this world. Still carrying the grief of losing my parents suddenly, I was taken in by a stranger relative. But then,
"We can't afford for you to graduate high school,"
my uncle said bluntly, denying me the opportunity to continue my education. Looking back, there must have been some money left by my parents. At that time, I was just a naive kid and accepted it as it was. This relative was a particularly mean person, often making comparisons between his own children and me, and it wasn't unusual for him to do such unreasonable things. Consequently, I didn't graduate from high school and started working right after dropping out of high school. The job was at a factory, introduced to me by my relative. This company was notoriously exploitative, and they overworked me because I was the youngest. It's likely that my relative had fed them some story about me.
"He's a fool and knows nothing, so you can work him hard."
That's something my relative would say. Now I think about it and wonder how they could do such things, but back then, I didn't have the luxury or the knowledge to think that way. I worked tirelessly every single day. However, that routine came to an end one day. A client of the company came to tour the factory unexpectedly. The site was thrown into chaos. I was working as usual.
"Is that guy really young, or is he just a temp?"
A sharply dressed person asked the factory manager.
Well,
The factory manager, who had been exploiting me, answered evasively while breaking out in a cold sweat. Suspecting something from the answer, the suited person came over to me and started talking.
"Hey, you're an employee here. Oh."
When he turned to face me, he looked incredibly surprised.
"Are you by any chance Yasmin's son?"
Yasmin was my mother's name. But why would this person know my mother's name? Later, I was taken to a separate room and asked for details. During our conversation, it turned out that this person was my mother's brother. In other words, my uncle.
"You look just like my sister, Yasmin. I thought she had come back."
Indeed, I did resemble my mother, and often got teased for having a feminine face. Then, my uncle, David, revealed a shocking truth I hadn't known. My parents had eloped. My mother's family was very strict, and they had opposed her marrying my father, who was an orphan. In defiance of her family, my mother had run away from home. Afterward, she married my father, and that's when I was born. I never heard about my grandparents from my parents, and since I had always been this way since I could remember, I never questioned it. Unlike other kids, I thought I had no grandparents or close relatives.
Meeting like this must be some kind of fate. How about you come live with me?
I was surprised but nodded in agreement to David's proposal. After getting a job, I had been kicked out of my relative's house and had been living a lonely life. Even when I came home exhausted, there was no one waiting for me. I was tired of that kind of life. Later, I officially became David's adopted son. David was very kind and became like a second father to me. He taught me all sorts of things, given how naive I was about the world. Eventually, I came to understand that the company where I had been employed was extremely toxic, and the way they treated me was indeed workplace harassment.
Hey, Ryan, how about you quit your job and get your high school equivalency?
Huh?
I'll cover your living expenses in the meantime.
David offered, but I declined. I do want to get my high school equivalency eventually, but I want to pay for it with money I've earned myself.
But
it's okay. Well, first I need to find a new job anyway. I can hardly get any time for myself at that company. Then, David made another suggestion.
Then, may I introduce you to a job opening I know of? There seems to be a vacancy.
Really?
Of course. Let me do at least this much as your father. And you know, you can rely on me more. You're just like your mother, so dependable. But you take on too much by yourself.
I just gave a wry smile to David, who seemed a bit annoyed as he said this. Afterward, I successfully changed jobs. Though introduced by David, I still went through a proper hiring process. The new department was in sales. It was perfect for me, given my physical strength from working in the factory. Incidentally, the company I used to work for had already gone bankrupt. It seems that company was already struggling financially, and David's company had stopped doing business with them. Also, David told the mean relative who had treated me poorly, never contact him again. He also hired a lawyer to ensure that my parents' assets were properly transferred to me. It turns out the relative had been dipping into the money left by my parents. Thanks to David's firm stance, I managed to recover it all. I can't thank David enough. At the new job he helped me get, I plan to work hard also as a way to repay David's kindness. That was the plan, but things seem kind of tense lately, don't they? On the way home from work, I let out a big sigh. Our company had a new president. The previous president had suddenly fallen ill, and his son had taken over. However, as soon as the new president took office, two factions formed within the company. The factions consisted of the president's brother, who was the executive vice president, and the other faction consisted of the new president himself. The faction supporting the executive vice president does not recognize the new president's appointment, insisting that the executive vice president should be the one in charge. Many old-timers in the company are involved in secretive operations to oust the new president. The faction supporting the new president, on the other hand, is directly opposing the executive vice president's faction, aiming to continue the management style inherited from the former president. However, lately, the new president's faction has been losing ground. The head of the sales department, who respected the former president, had expressed his desire to support the new president, but he was suddenly demoted to a branch office the other day, and a member of the executive vice president's faction took over as the new department head. The executive vice president's faction emphasizes educational credentials, and being a high school dropout, I seem to be an easy target for them. Despite just starting out, I have already been subjected to numerous instances of harassment from my new boss, Anthony, the head of the sales department.
A high school dropout idiot like you should leave this company right now.
Such derogatory comments have become the norm, and I am disparaged daily. Recently, he has even started to sabotage my work, significantly increasing my stress levels. I wasn't siding with anyone at first, but now I am firmly in the new president's camp. The sales department has many young people, and many are supportive of the new president, which is why I've managed to stay without quitting. But this can't go on. The harassment from my boss is intolerable. Moreover, if he continues to interfere with my work, I'll have to consider some measures. Since David introduced me to this company, I'm not thinking of changing jobs. But depending on the situation, I might have to consider looking for a new job. I sigh deeply again. I continue to endure the harassment from my boss. It seems that my boss has finally reached his breaking point with me. One day, I was falsely accused by my boss.
The products supposed to be used for a client's event weren't ordered because of this guy's mistake. The event is ruined. Take responsibility.
I wasn't involved with that event at all, and I didn't even know such an event was held. However, my boss had fabricated evidence to claim I was responsible.
I'm going to report this to the executive vice president.
The boss, as he uttered those words, had a triumphant smile on his face. With heavy, rough footsteps, he stormed out of the sales department office. I wonder if he really went to the executive vice president's office. Powerless, all I could do was watch his back as he left. Then, just a few minutes later, I was summoned by the executive vice president.
I heard from Anthony. You've done something outrageous, hadn't you?
While grinning unpleasantly, the executive vice president Steve said this. Next to him, with a similarly unpleasant grin, was my boss, Anthony.
Really? During such a tough time for the company, how could you do something like this? This is why low-educated people like high school dropouts.
Just as you said, Steve, the former president used to hire without focusing on education, but these low-educated folks always seem to have some issue.
My boss said this aggressively. Both the executive vice president and my boss are college graduates. To them, someone like me seems less than a bug.
Such a useless person should be fired immediately, Steve.
Yeah, that's right. Our company is becoming something new as well.
Our company was recently acquired by a major corporation. Since the acquisition was of the entire company, the internal organization and business operations have not changed much so far. We had been notified that there might be some changes in the future, but I never expected that one of those changes would include my dismissal.
The company is being reborn, so we no longer need a high school dropout like you. We don't need bottom-rung people like you in the new company. From now on, our company intends to cut out the bad parts. So, you should disappear as well.
The executive vice president said this with a smirk. Is he really going to such lengths to frame me for mistakes just to get me out of the company? I sighed quietly and slowly began to speak in response. I agree. It's time for a refresh, isn't it?
What?
Bad pus needs to be drained early. If left alone, it only worsens the infection. When I said this, the executive vice president showed a moment of confusion. However, he quickly returned to his malicious grin.
Look at you, knowing your place. I'll give you that much credit. Now, get out of here.
I didn't say anything more to his words and quietly left the room. Glancing back, I saw both of them smiling smugly. They seemed very pleased that I was leaving the company obediently. It seems there's been a misunderstanding. My words did not reach the two of them as I had closed the door behind me. And the next day. Good morning. Despite being told by the executive vice president that I was fired, I showed up for work as usual, which made Anthony's eyes pop out in surprise.
Why are you here? You were supposed to be fired.
Me? Fired?
Yes, you agreed to it, didn't you?
Oh, I see. There has been a misunderstanding. I didn't agree. What needs to be refreshed isn't me, it's you guys. With that, I walked away from the sales department office.
Where do you think you're going?
To the president's office. Perfect timing. Please also have you come, Anthony. There's something important we need to discuss.
Something important? What could you possibly want to talk about now?
When I arrived at the president's office, I knocked and opened the door. And then,
All executives are fired.
there, the president and all the company's executives were assembled. And the one announcing the firing was none other than David. This company had been recently acquired by a major corporation, and the head of that corporation was David. David came from a family of elite business managers on my mother's side, and he was exceptionally talented. Still in his 50s, he was already at the top of a major corporation. I was introduced to this company after David decided to acquire it.
That company is becoming part of our group, so it'll be easier to understand the situation. For me, it's comforting to have Ryan nearby.
However, after the acquisition was finalized, the president fell ill and the company was thrown into chaos. Since this company is also David's, I had been reporting the situation inside the company to him regularly. David didn't just take my word for it, but started an investigation using his subordinates. He was preparing to oust the executive vice president's faction when suddenly I was called by the executive vice president and told I was fired. When I reported this, David was angrier than I'd ever seen him.
How dare they do this to my son?
Then, he decided to come to our company himself to settle things.
All executives are fired. We can't possibly accept that.
The executive vice president retorted, pale-faced, to David. However, David glared back fiercely.
We don't need executives who engage in misconduct. Steve, it seems you've been doing whatever you want in this company as the executive vice president.
As he spoke, David presented numerous pieces of evidence of embezzlement by the executive vice president. It appears that only the executive vice president's faction was involved in this embezzlement, and the president's faction was unaware.
I said all executives earlier, but I'll correct that. Any executive involved in this matter will be fired.
But, please wait.
Silence. I won't listen to excuses.
Anthony, the head of the sales department next to me, also understanding the situation, turned pale.
How could this happen?
Yo, that man is my father. Well, actually, he's my uncle. I've reported everything about you to him.
What?
David said he can't forgive those who harassed me. I suppose some action will be taken against you too, Anthony. Then Anthony's face turned from pale to furious.
This is all your fault. How dare you set us up?
He shouted and lunged at me. But David stopped his arm.
Don't lay a hand on my son. Don't make me angrier.
Yikes.
Receiving the full force of David's presence, Anthony let out a pitiful sound. And he started trembling pitifully. Afterwards, all executives from the executive vice president's faction were either fired, demoted, or transferred to branch offices. Steve, the executive vice president, was dismissed for embezzlement. Anthony, the head of the sales department, was demoted and transferred to a remote branch. The president's faction faced no repercussions.
Your father, the former president, was very good to me. I have high hopes for you as his son.
The new president, hearing this from David, nodded firmly. With the executive vice president's faction gone, the atmosphere in the company greatly improved, and the employees worked freely and happily. The fact that I was the son of the top of the acquiring company was kept quiet by the new president. Thanks to this, I can work freely and vigorously. I plan to continue working hard in this company to repay David, who has been like a real father to me.